Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about a book. Yes, an actual book today, because this is my second attempt at a video discussing Rejoice, A Knife to the Heart by Steven Erikson. So let's get this started, shall we? And we start by saying thanks to one of my Patreon backers, John, thumbnail master and good friend. Thank you for being there for me. Cheers, brother. If you want one of those personalized cheers, there's a Patreon. I would very much appreciate you going there, but if you can't afford it or you don't want to, that's totally fine. I'm just, poor. Anyway, let's get started and talk about the book. So this will be a discussion of Rejoice, A Knife to the Heart by Steven Erikson from 2018, and I will just assume that you have read the book or you don't care about spoilers, because this will be very much full spoilers. I will also make some comments on the Malazan Book of the Fallen, because I do believe there are some connections that are important here, so there will be slight spoilers for the Malazan Book of the Fallen, although I'll just, point to scenes in a specific book and not say too much about it, so I'll try to keep it as accessible as possible. All right, so let's start and talk about Rejoice, what it is, why it is important, and what it does different than other books of its type. All right, so first I'm going to look at what Rejoice does uniquely, and then I'll look at the connections to Malazan. So let's start with what it is. It is a first contact novel, which, has a venerable tradition in science fiction literature and movies and general science fiction media. But it is also, at the same time, a commentary on science, on those first contact novels. And I think that's where its strength comes from. Yes, it is written in a more journalistic style. We have the usual, looking at different characters, viewpoint characters, to see how they deal with that first contact by an alien super intelligence, basically. And we'll talk about those aspects in a minute, but what it mainly does is comment on how humanity deals with first contact, and how maybe the first contact novels that we know, or that are big in the tradition, are maybe problematic in the way they portray that first contact. What do I mean by that? It is very much about the fact that a lot of first contact movies and novels make that first contact between people of power, people in positions of power. It's either scientists or military people or, politicians, or sometimes a combination of those three, where you have your American president sit down in a fighter plane and shoot down people. That kind of thing. And the question that obviously lies underneath that is are those people actually qualified to deal with that kind of stuff? Also, what does it say about a society that we think that first contact has to be handled by the military? Because there's a message in there somewhere, and those are elements that I think are important when we look at Rejoice. Because what happens in Rejoice is that first contact is mostly handled by science fiction authors. Now, there's more than just, self-praise in there, and I think that's the heart of Rejoice, is exactly there, and I'll just drop it in the beginning before we go into deeper things. And that is, Rejoice is a celebration of the imagination of humans, of our fantasy and our imagination. And there's reasons for that. First of all, yes, having a great imagination, having spent time thinking about how things might be, looking at different options, all of that stuff does prepare us for encountering scenarios that we have maybe actually looked at in our heads. And if all those scenarios, which kind of ties back again, right? If all those scenarios that we know of first contact are aliens come over, we shoot them, or aliens, come over, we talk to them, about our scientists and politicians talk to them, then that limits our capability of dealing with anything actually strange or foreign, because we'll just sort it into those very specific patterns that we are used to from media. And that's kind of a problem. over time. I mean, it can be a problem, right? So there is that aspect of our imagination, and there's a responsibility with, writing or making movies about first contact or any other thing really, and sticking to very few specific ways of how such scenarios can play out. If we limit our imagination when creating these kind of things, we also limit the imagination, or sort of limit the imagination of those who consume those kind of media, and that can have dire consequences. So there is that aspect. There is an additional aspect here that I think is important to talk about. And that is, once again, the power of the imagination, because the things we can imagine are the things we can then make real. So thinking about alternatives of how to live, alternatives of how things could have been, alternatives of how things should be, is the first step in our way to actually changing things. And that is an important key to Rejoice, because Rejoice, looks at our world right now and, we see that point where we're like, we're basically fucked. So can we actually get away from this? Is the point where we are right now, is that an inevitable point? And are there options for us to get away? And that's where imagination comes in, because being able to imagine alternative ways of living, being able to imagine different ways of getting out of the predicament that we have basically driven their entire planet into, that's a great power, and that's the first step that we need to take before we can actually go and change things. We need to have them in our brains. We need to imagine and think about them. And that's where artists come in. All kinds of artists, really. But in this specific case, obviously science fiction and fantasy writers, because they deal with, aliens and stuff. So that's what I mean when I say Rejoice is, at its heart, a celebration of imagination and of the arts, especially science fiction and fantasy, genres that have always been, looked at somewhat askance by the more established part of the literary community in a lot of ways. So there's certainly a bit of a celebration of like, look, we are actually important because we do things that you guys never do because you're too stuck within the status quo, so to speak. And that is an important aspect here. Now, this is definitely something I've spoken about before, and I will come back again and again to, because, it's important. And I feel Rejoice does all of that in its structure and in its focus on science fiction authors, on imaginary things, on the imagination, and on possible ways out of our predicament. Now, why is all of that important? Well, as I said, our situation right now is pretty fucked up. And for a lot of us, it's very difficult to imagine alternatives or even just ways out of our current situation. And that's what Rejoice shows us with its different viewpoint characters. Rejoice does do the thing that Stephen Erikson often does, which is switch through several, viewpoint characters to make a greater point. In this case, we look at both the people that suffer the most from our current system, and we look at the people that profit the most from our current system, and we look at how both are at the end of the day still fundamentally unhappy, which is a larger point that we'll come back to. So we have people living in like a situation of domestic violence. We have viewpoint characters, child soldiers in Africa being victims of that continuous, cycle of violence. And we'll come back to the cycle of violence in a bit. We have, arms dealers, arms smugglers. We have company owners that do a lot of terrible things in the name of, self-aggrandizement, basically. We have all of these aspects in there, and we just look at how having our world torn apart does impact those kinds of people. And there is certainly, with the way that Stephen Erikson sets up this story, there is an element of, leveling the playing field again, giving those people that have been at the receiving end of the system a chance to maybe become better, maybe making it out of there alive, maybe even giving them another chance to, make up for some of the things that we have done, because most of us have done terrible things, or not exactly terrible, like most of us have done some things we're not really proud of because of the way the system is rigged. and having, these different stages, seeing what happens if, we take away violence, we take away, some of the fundamental elements of human society in the 21st century, how that impacts, things for possibly the better for those of us who are stuck in the system and are not right up on top. So in that way, it is very much a political book. But it goes deeper than that. It goes very much deeper than that. And that's sort of where we slowly move over into the Malazan sphere, because there's a lot of a lot of themes that come up in this book that come up in the Malazan Book of the Fallen as well, and that you can maybe look at as the key driving forces in the writings of Stephen Erikson, or the things that he wrestles with the most. And they're obviously always connected. One of them is the already aforesaid, mentioned cycle of violence. The idea that people under pressure lash out and inflict harm on those weaker than themselves, which is usually children. Well, it's also, other weak people that are weaker, but the important bit is those children who grow up in that system of pressure and violence. So what will they do when they grow up? They'll continue that, ever-moving cycle of violence, which, is why we have someone like Kolo in this book, the character who was, kidnapped as a child by soldiers or, mercenaries in the Congo, and then after being a child soldier for a while, turns himself into the leader of a group of so-called mercenaries, just perpetuating that eternal cycle of violence. And that is one of the, if not the most important element of Stephen Erikson's writing in general. The things we do to our children, they will do to their children, and on and on and on. And the question is, can we break that cycle of violence? Because that's the most important thing. We have to stop hurting our children if we want to have any chance of breaking that cycle. Now, that's one part of that equation, right, is the cycle of violence. The other part, however, is that continual struggle, the pressure that we all, suffer under. Which is where the idea of scarcity comes in. And there's a lot of discussion about scarcity and post-scarcity in this book. And there's an important message here, and that is that while obviously living on one planet means that there are limits to our natural resources. So there is some level of scarcity while we are stuck on one planet, right? That is not the issue. The issue is that the system that we have chosen to live under, which is capitalism at the end of the day, although, it's been around for much longer than just, our current iteration of capitalism, is a system of scarcity. And it's a system of artificial scarcity. That's the important key here, because the system that we have built right now only works if goods and services and resources are limited, so we can then raise prices and so forth. So the pressure, the continuous struggle that humans live under in this system are built into the system and are based on artificial scarcity. And that level of pressure, that level of struggle, of continuous struggle, then leads to, as I said, people lashing out, driving that human cycle of violence. And the question there, of course, is, can we actually break that artificial scarcity, that addiction to scarcity, so to speak? That's where those two elements that are important in the writings of Stephen Erikson are connected. That the system we have kind of gotten ourselves into is one that actually leads to the circle of violence, to the cycle of violence that then creates even more human suffering and makes us, stuck, gets us stuck in that ever-moving, spiral into further doom and doom and doom. And the questions are, can we get out of there? That's obviously the big question of the writings of Stephen Erikson, whether it is the Malazan Book of the Fallen, or it is Rejoice, or even Willful Child. So there we have the main thing that Rejoice does. It is, as I said, an ode to imagination, to science fiction imagination in particular, as maybe the way out of our current predicament, because it helps us imagine alternative ways to live, to go back to forms of subsistence economies, where everyone has the things they need, which is something that we are probably capable of doing if we actually dismantle the system. Which the question is, like, how do we get about that? Because the dark question underneath all of that is, of course, the question is, like, was the establishment of that system of artificial scarcity, was that built into our human nature? Is there such a thing as human nature? Was it inevitable that we actually end up there? Now, that's a question that we'll talk about in a different video when we talk about The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow, which was released after Rejoice, but does tackle a lot of the same issues. All right, now let's look at the connection to Malazan and why I think you can read Rejoice as the key to the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Now, I have already mentioned that both series of books, or in this case one book, deal with the same kind of questions, which is does human nature and human life inevitably lead to an exploitation of our environment, more or less artificial scarcity, which then furthers that cycle of violence, which leads to self-destruction and destruction of our environment? Is that inevitable? And when we look at what the Malazan Book of the Fallen does, because of the way it is structured, it is obviously a secondary world fantasy, so it's not our world. It also does not give us the answers. It just shows human life. By human life, I also mean, all these different species in there, whether it's Jakut or Trell or Toblikai or Teist Andy or any other of those. It does do that. It shows us all of that, and it shows us a lot of human misery and human suffering. It shows again and again that cycle of violence. It shows again and again that cycle of exploitation, over-exploitation of the environment, which leads to death and violence again and again, which is sort of where you get the whole T'Lana mass situation and so forth. It does all of that, but it does not give us an answer. Because what I believe it wants from the reader is to actually see all of that and then reach out and, feel empathy and feel compassion for the people in those situations, and maybe transfer that empathy and compassion to people in our world that are in similar situation. It expects the reader, these books expect the reader to actually make that leap from a secondary fantasy world into the situation, towards the situation in our world. And that's sometimes kind of hard, because we have gotten used to reading fantasy as escapism, as something that happens in fairyland, and all of that being the problems of people in a different world. So we don't necessarily make that, leap to our world and our problems. And I do believe now that is where Rejoice comes in, because Rejoice is in our world. It's very hard to forget that and understand and make ourselves believe that the problems described in Rejoice are not our problems right now, and we should actually go and do something about it. So that's where I do believe that Rejoice does fill or help build a bridge between a secondary fantasy world and our world, in our imaginations, and just states a lot of the issues stated in the Malazan Book of the Fallen in a much clearer way, in a much more direct, on-the-nose kind of way. Because maybe we just didn't get it when we read the Malazan Book of the Fallen, or we're just blinded by all the lasers and fireballs, which are awesome, don't get me wrong. And there are some very specific scenes where we can see that, and that is the last part of this video, which is influences, something we'll get back to in a different video at some point. Every author writes with the things they are interested in, and those are often motivated by books they have read, movies they have seen, and so forth. And there's like at least two very specific ones that we see mentioned in Rejoice, explicitly mentioned. Now, there's more than that. Because Rejoice being set in our world allows Stephen Erikson to actually name drop those books. It's kind of difficult to do that in a secondary fantasy world, unless you're Terry Pratchett and writing Discworld, because it does break immersion and all of these wonderful things. Now, as I said, as you're Terry Pratchett, you don't care about that crap, and you just like make all the jokes and references you want. But Stephen Erikson is not Terry Pratchett. So we have, for example, the book of the Gaia hypothesis. Well, it's only called Gaia and something else by James Lovelock, which gets mentioned explicitly in Rejoice several times, and it's clearly a book that has had influence on Stephen Erikson, because when we look at Memories of Ice, the beginnings of Memories of Ice, there's a scene with Quick Ben and a priestess. I'll just use it, the word priestess, and the things that Quick Ben looks at there, and the Malazan world being one big macroorganism, everything being locked into each other into like a biome, dare I say that, is very much the same thesis as the thesis propounded in Gaia by James Lovelock, which gets discussed explicitly in Rejoice. So there's one of those books that comes up again and again, and this time around, Erikson can just like name drop those references, and maybe some of us will actually go and read those books. Who knows? Stranger things have happened. The other one that he mentions here is definitely Julian Jaynes's The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, when they have a discussion about when Adam and Samantha August have a discussion about consciousness, and that being started around 3,000 years ago. Yeah, that's the thesis of Julian Jaynes's The Origins of Consciousness, right there. And when you've read that book, which you should, you will find echoes of that in the way that some things happen in the Malazan world. When you look at the First Empire and Decimbilakis, for example, that's very much something where I would suspect that Stephen Erikson put his reading of Julian Jaynes into actual, into the Malaz world. But once again, it's sort of more or less explicitly mentioned in Rejoice. Same goes obviously for stuff like Star Trek and the Culture series by Ian M. Banks. Which then, and this is sort of where we're tying the whole thing back again, which then obviously ties back to the fact that yes, it is science fiction media, it is media in general that forms our imagination, that decides how we think about stuff, which is why reading the Culture will help us understand scarcity and post-scarcity, which is why Star Trek has had such a huge influence on even those people that have not actually seen any Star Trek shows at all, have used a lot of the imagination. It's part of our general culture, at least Western part of cultural zeitgeist, our cultural subconscious at this point, and making clear how important that aspect is one of the strengths of Rejoice. So, to recap and sum this all up, Rejoice, A Knife to the Heart, is an explication of the themes found in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and a book in praise of the imagination of fantasy and science fiction literature in particular, as the one thing that can lead us out of the mess that we're in, because it helps us imagine alternate ways to live, ways to actually get out of this predicament, because we have to think about them first. We have to imagine them first before we can actually think about how to put them into action, and then we still need to go and actually do the thing. And that is a very powerful statement. It's a very powerful book in that regard, and I really hope you learned something from me talking about it this way. I'm glad I read it for the second time now. I will definitely go back again and again, and I hope you liked this video. If so, well, let me know what you think in the comments, and I don't know, like, subscribe, share, do all those things that I'm supposed to ask you for, and yeah, have a great day. Cheers.